On June 23, 1314, Robert the Bruce stood on the high ground near Stirling Castle, watching the largest English army ever assembled in Scotland march toward him with one purpose: his complete annihilation. Behind Bruce were roughly 8,000 Scottish soldiers, mostly common men armed with 12-foot spears, exhausted from years of guerrilla warfare, many barefoot and wearing little more than padded jackets for armor. Approaching were at least 20,000 English troops, including 3,000 heavy cavalry in full plate armor, the finest military force in Western Europe, led by King Edward II, who had sworn to finish what his father Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, had started. Every military calculation favored England. They outnumbered the Scots more than 2 to 1. Their cavalry were professional knights who had trained since childhood. Their infantry included thousands of Welsh longbowmen who could shoot arrows through armor at 200 yards. The English had money, supplies, and the backing of the richest kingdom in Europe. The Scots had desperation, 12-foot spears, and marshy ground. Bruce knew that if he lost this battle, Scottish independence would be crushed forever, his supporters would be executed, and he would likely die in the most horrific way the English could devise. But he also knew something the English didn't. Cavalry charges, no matter how magnificent, cannot break a wall of spears held by men who have nothing left to lose. To understand the absolute stakes at Bannockburn, you must understand what the English occupation had done to Scotland. In 1296, King Edward I of England had invaded Scotland after a succession crisis, claiming overlordship of the kingdom. What followed was systematic military subjugation. At the Battle of Dunbar in 1296, English forces had crushed the Scottish army, killed thousands and captured most of the Scottish nobility. Edward I then spent 2 years marching through Scotland, destroying resistance, executing rebels, and installing English garrisons in every major castle. He confiscated the Stone of Destiny, the ancient symbol of Scottish kingship, and took it to Westminster Abbey as a trophy. Scottish nobles were forced to swear fealty to England or lose their lands. Those who resisted were hanged, drawn, and quartered, their body parts displayed in Scottish cities as warnings. The most famous rebel, William Wallace, had led a brief uprising that won a stunning victory at Stirling Bridge in 1297, but Edward I had eventually captured him in 1305 and subjected him to one of history's most brutal executions. Wallace was hanged until nearly dead, then cut down while still conscious. His genitals were cut off and burned before his eyes. His abdomen was opened, and his intestines pulled out and burned. Only then was he beheaded and his body cut into quarters. His head was placed on a spike on London Bridge. His limbs were displayed in Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, as permanent warnings that rebellion against England ended in unimaginable horror. Robert the Bruce's path to leadership was complicated and morally ambiguous. He was Scottish nobility, with English landholdings, meaning he had conflicting loyalties. In the early years of English occupation, Bruce had actually sworn fealty to Edward I and fought against other Scottish rebels, calculating that cooperation with England was the only way to preserve his family's power and lands. But in 1306, Bruce made a decision that changed everything. He murdered his rival John Comyn in a church, an act considered sacrilegious and unforgivable, but one that eliminated the main obstacle to his claim to the Scottish throne. Bruce immediately had himself crowned King of Scots in a hasty ceremony, but his position was desperate. He had committed murder and sacrilege, been excommunicated by the Pope, and declared an outlaw by England. Edward I immediately sent armies to destroy him. Bruce spent the next year as a fugitive, hiding in caves and remote islands with a handful of supporters while English forces hunted him. His wife and daughter were captured by the English. His wife was imprisoned in harsh conditions. His daughter was placed in a cage and displayed publicly. 3 of his brothers were captured and executed. His sister was hung in a cage from Roxburgh Castle walls, exposed to the elements. The English wanted to make an example of Bruce's family to show what happened to those who defied English rule. But Bruce survived, and beginning in 1307, when Edward I died and was succeeded by his far less competent son, Edward II, Bruce began winning. He waged brilliant guerrilla warfare, avoiding pitched battles, ambushing English patrols, besieging English-held castles, and gradually building popular support among common Scots who saw him as their only hope for independence. By 1314, Bruce had recaptured most of Scotland's castles through clever siege tactics. His method was to attack at night with small teams who would scale walls with rope ladders, overwhelm sleeping garrisons, and hold the castle until it could be demolished to prevent the English from using it again. Bruce deliberately destroyed Scotland's own fortifications because he knew he couldn't hold them against English armies, so he denied them to everyone. This scorched earth strategy devastated Scotland, but prevented English occupation. By June 1314, only a handful of English-held castles remained, including Stirling Castle, one of Scotland's most strategic fortresses controlling the route north. Bruce's brother Edward had negotiated an agreement with Stirling's English garrison. If they weren't relieved by an English army by June 24, 1314, they would surrender. This created a deadline that forced Edward II's hand. The English king couldn't abandon Stirling without admitting he'd lost Scotland. He had to march north with overwhelming force and destroy Bruce once and for all. The English army that assembled in northern England in June 1314 was the largest military force England had fielded in years. Contemporary estimates vary wildly, but modern historians suggest roughly 20,000 to 25,000 soldiers, including approximately 3,000 heavy cavalry, 15,000 infantry, and several thousand Welsh longbowmen. The cavalry were England's elite armoured knights on war horses, trained since childhood in mounted combat, equipped with lances, swords, and full-plate armour that made them nearly invulnerable to most weapons. The longbowmen were professional soldiers, mostly Welsh, who could shoot 10 to 12 arrows per minute accurately at ranges up to 200 yards, with armour-piercing bodkin point arrows that could penetrate chainmail. The infantry included both professional soldiers and feudal levies, equipped with various weapons from swords and poleaxes to simple spears. This army was supported by a massive supply train with food, ammunition, and siege equipment, because Edward II expected to besiege Stirling if necessary. The English marched north through Scotland in late June, taking a week to cover the distance, their sheer size making them slow but seemingly unstoppable. They reached the area around Stirling on June 23rd, knowing the castle garrison's surrender deadline was the next day. Edward II was confident. He outnumbered the Scots more than 2 to 1. His cavalry was superior. His archers could slaughter infantry at range. All he had to do was force Bruce to fight, then use English military superiority to crush the Scottish army and end the independence movement forever. Robert the Bruce had chosen his battlefield carefully. The area near Bannockburn, a small stream about 2 miles south of Stirling Castle, had specific terrain advantages that could offset English numerical superiority. The ground was marshy and broken by streams, terrible terrain for heavy cavalry, which needed solid ground for effective charges. Bruce positioned his army on high ground called New Park, with the marshy areas and streams protecting his flanks. He organized his 8,000 men into 4 divisions of roughly 2,000 each, commanded by himself, his brother Edward Bruce, his nephew Thomas Randolph, and his loyal supporter James Douglas. Each division was trained to fight in schiltron formation, a Scottish tactical innovation that was essentially a circular or rectangular wall of 12-foot spears. The front ranks would kneel with spear butts braced against the ground, angled upward to impale charging horses. The rear ranks would stand with spears held horizontally, creating multiple layers of sharp steel. When properly maintained, a schiltron was nearly impenetrable to cavalry charges because horses instinctively refused to impale themselves on walls of spears, and if cavalry tried to ride around the formation, the schiltron could rotate to keep spears facing the threat. The weakness of schiltrons was that they were vulnerable to missile fire from archers and couldn't pursue fleeing enemies effectively. But Bruce had positioned his forces so that English archers couldn't get clear shots without entering the marshy ground, and he had no intention of pursuing anyone. His strategy was simple: hold position, let the English attack, and use terrain and schiltron formations to negate their cavalry advantage. The battle began on June 23rd, with preliminary skirmishes that revealed English tactical incompetence. A force of English cavalry under the Earl of Gloucester charged directly at Bruce's position without waiting for the main army to deploy properly, eager to win glory. They thundered toward the Scottish lines, expecting the common infantry to break and run, as Scottish armies had done in previous battles. Instead, Bruce's schiltrons held firm. The English cavalry hit the spear wall and simply stopped, horses refusing to impale themselves, knights unable to break through, turning into confused targets for Scottish spearmen who pulled riders from horses and killed them on the ground. Gloucester's forces retreated in disorder, having achieved nothing except demonstrating that cavalry charges couldn't break schiltron formations. Then, in one of the battle's legendary moments, an English knight named Henry de Bohun spotted Robert the Bruce slightly separated from his troops, apparently inspecting his lines. De Bohun, wearing full armor and riding a war horse, decided to win eternal fame by killing the rebel Scottish king in single combat. He couched his lance and charged at full speed. Bruce, wearing lighter armor and mounted on a smaller horse, waited until the last moment, then swerved aside, stood up in his stirrups, and brought his battle-axe down on de Bohun's helmet with such force that he split the English knight's skull and shattered his own axe. De Bohun fell dead. The Scots erupted in cheers. Bruce's only comment was reportedly annoyance that he'd broken his favourite axe. This moment electrified Scottish morale. Their king had just killed an armoured English knight in single combat, demonstrating that English military superiority was not inevitable, that courage and skill could overcome armour and training. Edward II, humiliated by the day's failures, decided to position his army overnight in the low-lying ground between the Bannockburn stream and the Pell stream burn, a position that seemed sensible for keeping his massive force together, but was actually catastrophic. The English army spent the night crammed into marshy ground that was already difficult terrain, made worse by 20,000 men and horses churning it into mud. Sleep was impossible. Soldiers and horses were exhausted, hungry, and increasingly demoralized by the uncomfortable conditions. Bruce, watching from his higher ground, realized the English had made a fatal mistake. They were trapped in terrain where their cavalry couldn't maneuver effectively, where their numbers worked against them by creating congestion, and where a Scottish attack downhill would have both momentum and the advantage of attacking a disorganized enemy. On the morning of June 24th, Bruce made a decision that shocked both his own commanders and the English. Rather than waiting defensively, he ordered his schiltrons to advance directly toward the English army. This was audacious to the point of insanity. Light infantry advancing toward heavy cavalry and longbowmen should have been suicide. But Bruce understood that the terrain and English disorganization created a brief window where an aggressive attack might work. His schiltrons began moving forward in tight formation, 12-foot spears bristling, advancing at walking pace to maintain cohesion, heading directly toward the English position. The English response was confused and poorly coordinated. Edward II had not expected the Scots to attack and had no clear battle plan. Different English commanders gave contradictory orders. Some cavalry units attempted charges against the advancing schiltrons, but the marshy ground slowed their horses and prevented the full-speed impact charges that were cavalry's main weapon. When the English horsemen hit the Scottish spear walls at reduced speed, they simply couldn't break through. Horses reared and refused to press forward into the bristling spears. Knights tried to use swords and lances to break the formations, but 12-foot spears kept them at distance, and when individual knights pressed too close, Scottish spearmen pulled them from horses and killed them with daggers and axes. The cavalry charges that should have shattered the Scottish lines instead broke against them like waves against rocks, then fell back in disorder, congesting the already crowded English position. The Welsh longbowmen, who should have been England's decisive weapon, found they couldn't shoot effectively. The marshy ground prevented them from positioning at optimal range and angle. When they did shoot, their arrows often hit their own cavalry who were mixed up with the Scots. English commanders pulled the archers back, then tried to reposition them, but by then the Scottish schiltrons were too close and advancing too steadily. Bruce had sent his small cavalry force, only about 500 light horsemen under the Mareschal, to harass the English archers, and this was enough to prevent them from forming effective shooting positions. The battle became a grinding infantry melee in terrible terrain. The English heavy cavalry, unable to charge effectively, dismounted and tried to fight as infantry. But plate armor designed for horseback was exhausting to fight in on foot, especially in churned mud. The English infantry tried to push back the Scottish schiltrons, but advancing toward 12-foot spears held by determined men in tight formation was nearly impossible. The Scots maintained discipline, kept their formations tight, and simply pushed forward step by step. English soldiers who got close enough to strike at the Scots found themselves impaled on multiple spears before they could land blows. The schiltron formation meant every Scottish spearman was protected by the spears of the men beside and behind him, creating overlapping layers of defense. The English, in contrast, were fighting as individuals or small groups without coordinated tactics, increasingly exhausted from fighting in armor on muddy ground and demoralized by their inability to break the Scottish formations. The battle lasted hours with neither side able to gain decisive advantage, but attrition favored the Scots, who were fighting in better terrain, had simpler equipment that didn't exhaust them as quickly, and had defensive formations that minimized their casualties while inflicting steady losses on the English. As the morning wore into afternoon, English exhaustion and demoralization became critical. Heavily armored knights were collapsing from heat and exhaustion. Infantry units were disorganized and leaderless. The congested battlefield meant English numbers became a disadvantage as men in the rear couldn't reach combat, while those in front were exhausted and needed relief that couldn't reach them. Then Bruce deployed his secret weapon, the small folk, several thousand Scottish camp followers and civilians who had been positioned out of sight behind the Scottish lines. These were not trained soldiers, but ordinary people, servants, women, even children, who had followed the army and been given whatever makeshift weapons were available. Bruce had them form up behind the hill and begin marching forward with banners raised, creating the appearance of massive Scottish reinforcements arriving. The English, exhausted and demoralized after hours of failing to break the Scottish schiltrons, saw what appeared to be thousands of fresh troops cresting the hill behind the Scots and believed they were facing a much larger army than they'd thought. This psychological shock broke English morale. Units in the rear began retreating without orders, trying to get out of the congested killing ground. The retreat spread forward as panic overtook discipline. What had been a grinding stalemate suddenly became a rout, as English soldiers abandoned the fight and fled toward the Bannockburn stream behind them. The retreat became a catastrophe. Thousands of heavily armored English soldiers trying to cross the marshy stream in full armor found themselves trapped in mud and water. Many drowned, dragged under by the weight of their own armor. Others were caught by pursuing Scots and killed. The stream became so choked with bodies that later Scots could reportedly walk across on corpses without getting wet. Edward II himself, surrounded by his bodyguard of 500 knights, fled the battlefield, abandoning his army to save himself. He rode directly to Stirling Castle seeking refuge, but the castle's governor, knowing his position was now hopeless, refused to let Edward in, unwilling to be besieged. Edward and his guards rode desperately south, pursued by Scottish cavalry, barely escaping capture. The casualties at Bannockburn were catastrophic for England. Contemporary accounts vary wildly, but modern estimates suggest roughly 4,000 to 7,000 English dead, including many nobles and knights, versus perhaps 500 Scottish casualties. The disparity reflects the nature of the battle. The Scots fought defensively in formation, protecting each other with overlapping spears, while the English repeatedly charged into those formations and died. The English nobility paid an especially heavy price. The Earl of Gloucester was killed leading cavalry charges. Over 30 English barons and bannerets died, along with hundreds of knights, the military elite of England. For a medieval army, these were irreplaceable losses. Training a knight took 20 years and enormous wealth. Losing hundreds in a single battle devastated England's military capacity. The equipment losses were equally severe. Thousands of horses, thousands of sets of armor, weapons, supplies, the entire baggage train with Edward II's personal treasure, all captured by the Scots. Poor Scottish soldiers became wealthy overnight, looting English corpses and abandoned equipment. But the strategic consequences exceeded even these heavy losses. Edward II's humiliating flight and abandonment of his army destroyed what remained of his authority. He had brought England's largest army to destroy a rebel force half its size and been utterly defeated. The Stirling Castle garrison immediately surrendered to Bruce. Every remaining English garrison in Scotland either abandoned their positions or negotiated surrenders. Within weeks of Bannockburn, Scotland was functionally independent with English forces expelled. But victory at Bannockburn didn't immediately end the war. Edward II refused to acknowledge Scottish independence or recognize Bruce as king. The conflict continued for 14 more years, with raids and counter-raids across the border. Bruce invaded northern England repeatedly, burning towns and extracting tribute, using brutality to force England to accept Scottish independence. The Scottish raids were vicious, deliberately targeting civilians to create pressure on the English crown. Towns that refused to pay protection money were burned. Populations were massacred or enslaved. Bruce used terror as a strategic weapon because Scotland couldn't win a long war of attrition against England's superior resources. The goal was to make the cost of continuing the war unbearable for English border regions, until they pressured their king to make peace. Finally, in 1328, the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton formally ended the war. England recognized Scottish independence, and Robert I, no longer the Bruce, now acknowledged as legitimate king, as Scotland's rightful monarch. The Stone of Destiny was supposed to be returned, but mysteriously couldn't be found and remained in England. Bruce had achieved his goal, but at enormous cost. Scotland had been devastated by decades of war. Entire regions were depopulated. The economy was in ruins. Infrastructure had been deliberately destroyed. And Bruce himself was dying, probably from leprosy, his body ravaged by years of living rough during guerrilla warfare. He died in 1329, just 1 year after seeing his life's goal achieved. The mythology that developed around Bannockburn transformed it from a tactical victory into a founding moment of Scottish national identity. The battle became proof that Scotland could defeat England, that common men with spears could overcome armoured nobility, that determination and clever tactics could offset numerical and economic disadvantages. Stories of Bruce splitting Henry de Bohun's skull, of schiltrons holding against cavalry charges, of the small folk appearing over the hill to break English morale, became legendary, retold and embellished over centuries. Bruce became Scotland's greatest hero, the king who won independence through brilliance and courage. But the reality was more complex. Bruce had committed murder to claim the throne. He had waged brutal warfare that devastated Scotland. He had used terror tactics against English civilians. His victory at Bannockburn was achieved partly through English incompetence. Edward II's terrible leadership and poor tactical decisions were as important as Scottish skill. The schiltron formations that won the battle were not Bruce's innovation. They'd been used at Falkirk in 1298, where they failed against English longbowmen. Bruce's genius was recognizing when terrain would allow schiltrons to work. And Scottish independence, won at such cost, would last less than 4 centuries before the 1707 Acts of Union peacefully merged Scotland and England into Great Britain, making all the bloodshed retroactively pointless from a long-term political perspective. The human cost of the Scottish Wars of Independence, of which Bannockburn was just one battle, is difficult to calculate but was certainly immense. Scotland's population in 1300 was perhaps 500,000. By 1330, it may have been reduced to 300,000 or less. That's a 40% population decline from war, massacre, starvation, and disease caused by decades of conflict. Entire regions of Scotland were depopulated. Agricultural systems collapsed from repeated destruction. Infrastructure from bridges to mills was deliberately demolished. The generational trauma affected Scotland for centuries. Most casualties were not soldiers, but civilians caught between armies, murdered in raids, starved when crops were burned, displaced and dying of exposure. Women and children suffered especially, killed in massacres, raped by soldiers from both sides, sold into slavery when their villages were captured. These victims are not remembered in the heroic stories of Bannockburn. They don't appear in the mythology of Scottish independence, but they paid the real price for Bruce's ambitions and Edward's pride. The Battle of Bannockburn saved Scottish independence, but it saved an independence that had already cost tens of thousands of civilian lives and would cost tens of thousands more before the wars finally ended. The tactical lessons of Bannockburn influenced European warfare for decades. The battle proved that disciplined infantry in defensive formations could defeat cavalry if terrain was favorable and discipline held. Swiss pikemen would use similar tactics to dominate battlefields for the next 2 centuries. The failure of English cavalry and archery suggested that the combined arms approach that had worked at Falkirk required proper terrain and coordination, which Edward II failed to provide. But perhaps the most important lesson was strategic rather than tactical. Brilliant generalship and tactical skill could achieve victory against numerical odds, but only when the enemy made mistakes. Bruce won at Bannockburn because Edward II made catastrophically bad decisions. Edward positioned his army in marshy ground, failed to coordinate his different forces, allowed English units to attack piecemeal, and abandoned his troops when the battle turned against him. Against a competent English commander, Bruce's outnumbered army might well have been destroyed. The battle was as much a story of English failure as Scottish success, though Scottish nationalist mythology understandably emphasizes the latter. The legacy of Bannockburn in Scottish culture cannot be overstated. It remains Scotland's most celebrated military victory, commemorated in monuments, songs, poems, and annual celebrations. The Bannockburn Heritage Centre near the battlefield attracts hundreds of thousands of visitors. Robert the Bruce is Scotland's national hero. His statue guards Edinburgh Castle. His face appeared on Scottish banknotes. The battle symbolizes Scottish resistance to English domination, proof of national identity, distinct from England. This mythology served important cultural purposes, maintaining Scottish identity during centuries of union with England, providing historical legitimacy for Scottish nationalism. But the mythology also obscures uncomfortable truths. Bruce's victory required brutal tactics, including deliberate terrorism against civilians. His guerrilla warfare destroyed Scotland's own infrastructure. His path to power included murder and betrayal. And the independence he won was achieved at a cost in human suffering that almost certainly exceeded any benefit to the common Scots who fought and died for it. The Scottish soldiers at Bannockburn, fighting in schiltron formations, watching English cavalry shatter against their spears, may have felt they were fighting for freedom, but most of them were feudal levies, essentially forced to fight by their lords, who would remain oppressed peasants, whether ruled by Scottish or English nobility. Independence changed which aristocrats extracted taxes and labour, but it didn't liberate common people from exploitation. The final irony of Bannockburn is that the battle's most lasting impact may have been on English rather than Scottish history. Edward II's catastrophic defeat destroyed his credibility as king. He had lost England's largest army, humiliated the realm, and demonstrated spectacular incompetence. His authority never recovered. English barons increasingly defied him, leading to civil conflicts and eventually to Edward's deposition in 1327. He was imprisoned, tortured, and allegedly murdered by having a red-hot poker inserted into his anus. A death supposedly chosen because it left no external marks, but rumors of the method spread as deliberate humiliation. His son Edward III, learning from his father's failures, would develop the tactical innovations that made English longbowmen supreme at Crécy and Poitiers. The trauma of Bannockburn drove English military reforms that ironically made England stronger. Meanwhile, Scotland's victory at Bannockburn, while winning independence, left the kingdom devastated and impoverished. Within a century, Scotland would be one of Europe's poorest kingdoms, unable to resist English cultural and economic influence, even while maintaining formal independence. Bannockburn won the war, but may have lost the long-term competition. By the time Scotland and England peacefully unified in 1707, England was a rising global power, while Scotland was economically desperate, and the union was partly motivated by Scottish bankruptcy. The battlefield itself today is quiet farmland, peaceful and unremarkable except for the monuments. The marshy ground where thousands died has been drained. The streams where armoured knights drowned are small and easily crossed. Nothing in the landscape speaks to the horror of June 24, 1314, when 8,000 Scottish spearmen broke 20,000 English invaders and changed the course of history. But the Bannockburn still flows, and if you walk its banks, you can imagine them choked with bodies, the water running red, English knights drowning in their own armour while Scottish soldiers pulled survivors from the water and slit their throats. You can picture the marshy ground transformed into a hellscape of mud, blood and dying men, where heavily armoured nobles who had trained their entire lives for war died face down in Scottish mud, killed by common farmers wielding 12-foot spears. You can envision Robert the Bruce watching from the high ground as the English army disintegrated, achieving the victory that would secure his crown and Scotland's independence, knowing that he had gambled everything and won. 8,000 Scottish spearmen destroyed 20,000 English invaders in one afternoon, not through superior equipment or training, but through terrain, tactics, discipline, and English incompetence. It was one of medieval history's greatest upset victories, and like most great victories, it was built on a foundation of thousands of deaths, most of them anonymous soldiers whose names are forgotten but whose blood literally soaked into Scottish soil.